a lot of the stress came from going to the meeting and having this idea that I needed to be the one to ultimately build a relationship and walk away after a meeting with someone that wants to be in a relationship with our organization. And that's really stressful because it's completely imbalanced. You start the relationship off in the worst, most imbalanced way, that I need to get you to like me, versus we need to assess whether we have shared understanding of our work as an organization, who we are, what our values are, and then decide mutually if this is indeed mutually beneficial.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today with Tanya Rumble. Tanya, welcome to What the Fundraising.
Thank you so much for having me, Mallory. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this conversation. And why don't we just start with you giving a little introduction to yourself and your work, and then we'll dive into everything.
Sure. So Tanya Rumble. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I am a third culture kid. So I was born in Canada to parents not from Canada and raised in the United Arab Emirates. I now reside here in the beautiful High Park area of Toronto. That's a really lush part of the city with my young son. And I've been a professional fundraiser now for 15 years. And prior to that, I started my career in public health. I determined it was too slow for me. And so I wanted to take my understanding of health and burden of disease and apply a more entrepreneurial skill set to that work, which is what landed me in fundraising for health charities. And so for the last 5 years, I've been in higher ed advancement. And I'm also co-founded my own consultancy with a colleague that focuses on supporting fundraising organizations and fundraisers in their EDI journeys and how it shows up specifically within the power dynamics of fundraising and philanthropy.
Okay, so can we start there? Just kind of go straight to the heart of it. I mean, I feel like we started talking about this episode back in December of 2024. Now it's May of 2025. The world feels maybe even farther upside down than it did when we first started this conversation, especially as it comes to some of these topics. And so, I'd love to just kind of dive into how you think about this, and then we can go from there.
Sure. I mean, yesterday I was facilitating a session with some colleagues at an advancement shop in a university outside of the Greater Toronto region, so in a more rural part of Ontario, Canada. And someone asked me, is it post-EDI here? Are donors still interested in supporting EDI-related initiatives? And I think my answer really centers around my own values and my own optimism in this work. There will always be supporters if you bring an abundance mindset to this work and you're really clear on your values. You can always find donors and funders and partners that want to walk alongside you in the work. And so I don't think in the Canadian context that we are post-EDI. I think that we are very much still a nation of folks that believe in the importance of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And then separately, but kind of related, is our work around reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization. And so I think that when there are funders and folks that you find yourself in community with or in conversation with that are bristling at the term EDI or have an aversion to initiatives and programs that are designed to advance equity, I think that they would have been the same funders that would have felt that way a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So did it really change anything? No. Did it make them feel more comfortable espousing those values and sharing those? Yes. Did it change fundamentally what they would have supported? I don't think so. That's what I see in the Canadian context. I think I have a lot of real visceral concerns about how what's happening in the global context, not just in the United States, is having a reverberation for us here in Canada and our own challenges in the Canadian context. But I remain a person that comes at this work from a place of deep hope and optimism, because this is the sector I work in, and every sector has its challenges, but I genuinely believe that I have the opportunity to influence in this sector, and that there are people that are similarly invested in making fundraising a place that actually delivers public good and social impact for everyone, not just for the people that have the most positional power, the most structural advantage based on their identities. I believe that we can make this space one that really can deliver what charity is supposed to be about. Fundraising is not supposed to be about the practice of simply raising money. It's about what that money can do. That is why we issue tax receipts. That's why charities get special tax treatment, both in the United States, in Canada, and around the world. It's not because that they can raise money. It's because what they can do with that money. And I think that as fundraisers, we sometimes forget that because we feel far removed from our program colleagues and from the people that are closest to the challenges that we're trying to solve with the money that we are then going out there and brokering. And I think that that's our job, is actually to remind ourselves about what that money is supposed to catalyze forward, because it can't catalyze nothing. Like, money is not the catalytic agent. It's what it can do to support these missions that are already worthy on their own without a donor being part of the equation.
Okay, there's this sort of like nuance that I'm hanging on in your words, and also in kind of reading more about your work online, which I think somewhere you use the word restorative philanthropy. And so I'm curious about this intersection, this piece around kind of like holding our value as nonprofits, as community changers, as like social impact leaders, recognizing that value without kind of being, I don't know, beholden to donor like approval. I don't know what the like right word is, right? That we don't need a specific donor to tell us whether or not our work is valuable. And yet, obviously, money makes a lot of our work, if not all of our work, possible in certain ways. And one of the things I love about the way you talk about philanthropy and the way you talk about this work is like, what is a version of philanthropy and fundraising that feels good to fundraisers and good to organizations and restorative maybe to donors too, or at least feels good to those donors, not in a donor-centric way, like where they're being kind of prioritized or there's like donor primacy, but just like, what can fundraising look like where it feels good to everybody involved because everybody's really aligned around those values and that mission?
100%. And so for me, I'm based here in Canada, and I had the privilege of serving for the last almost 3 years on the Government Advisory Committee on the charitable sector, providing advice to our Canadian Revenue Agency and to the Minister of National Revenue on tax policy and other policy legislation and systemic change that would be of benefit to the charitable nonprofit sector. And in a lot of those conversations, we talked about what was happening in fundraising and philanthropy. What are those trends? And I think one of the trends that certainly I'm observing is that we have 86,000 charities in Canada. And many of them actually, if you look at their mission statements, are quite similar. Like, they're not that far apart, many of the charitable mission statements that you might read. But what does set them apart is their values and how they express those values. And I think that what I'm observing is that organizations and fundraising teams and institutions that have figured out what their values are comfortable expressing them and are comfortable building relationships with donors that are rooted in those values, and most importantly, rooted in the truth about what those values are having the most amount of success. Because I think that when you find yourself trying to pull people along that don't actually see your problem solution narrative in the same way, they don't share your beliefs, they don't have the same theory of change that you do around a particular problem set, whether it's poverty, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's the environment, then you spend a lot of unnecessary energy trying to drag them along rather than finding yourself in relationship with the kinds of donors that do share your values, where it's not as exhausting and taxing because you have that basis of shared understanding and shared values. And so when I think about this idea of like restorative philanthropy, one of the things that I think about is bringing wise relational practices to fundraising and not always using the term relationship. A relationship is earned. And so that's really helped me feel more empowered as a fundraiser to remember that I actually have agency and control and influence in the relationship that I'm cultivating with donors and other constituents as part of my role as an executive fundraiser. And when I got that framing, I really borrowed that from my Indigenous colleagues that I've had the privilege of working alongside at Toronto Metropolitan University in my day job as an executive director of fundraising. I borrowed a lot of that language and understanding from my colleagues that really helped me feel more empowered to say, I don't have to be in a relationship with every donor. I can bring wise relational practices to that work. But when you liberate yourself from this idea that you are in relationship with all these people, it's actually very freeing because a relationship is earned. A relationship should be based on shared values and objectives. And until you've established those things, it's simply just about getting to know someone and they're an acquaintance. And when I've been able to borrow that language and share that with others, I think it's really empowering to think about we're meeting someone where they're at and they're meeting us where we are at. And so the reason a donor is in conversation with you is because you equally have something to bring to the exchange. You equally have something to offer. And that might mean that they can achieve their philanthropic objectives and legacy by giving to your organization because there's no other organization doing the kind of work that you're doing that aligns with their values, that they believe that you're the most impactful, the most efficient at doing this work. And so there's a whole variety of reasons why a donor is sitting with you, and we forget about that. We forget that there's a reason why they've been willing to take the call. There's a reason that they were willing to sit with us. And so bringing wise relational practices into that exchange is really important. And so that starts from a place of truth and authenticity. And so one of the things I do as a practice, if someone shares their belief about the work that our organization is engaged with, and their beliefs are actually rooted in misinformation, disinformation, or untruths, I have an obligation and a responsibility to correct that by sharing how we view the problem, what our theory of change is, our understanding of the issues, and to back that up with empirical, qualitative, and quantitative data that I can point to because we are actually experts in this. And they're sharing their point of view, not just because they want us to validate them, because they're looking to test that we understand where they're coming from. They're sharing their passion for the work. And so we have an obligation to be truthful in the way that we respond to that information that they then have shared with us by in turn sharing in kind what we know about the problem, what we know about the impact that we are having, what we know about those that are closest to the cause. And so that's really made me feel a lot more empowered in this work and made me feel like there's some restoration that can happen through philanthropy. I think similarly, I think a lot about the terminology of ecosystem. And that's something I share a lot in the work that I do through Recast Philanthropy with clients and colleagues, is this idea that when we talk to the donor and we constantly make the donor the hero of the story, A, it can feel disempowering as an organization. B, it's not truthful because, again, money cannot catalyze nothing forward. You need to have something that money can do. You have to have a program that someone is that is worthy of being funded in order for that money to do anything for your organization. And so when we use the terminology of ecosystem, it acknowledges all the constituent parts that make up that ecosystem. And so just like an ecosystem in the kind of the bios in the physical environment that surrounds us, we want it to be balanced. And so when the donor is more important than the people that are closest to the solutions that we are trying to propel forward, if the donor is closest to the beneficiaries of the funds that they are giving, if the donor is more important than the staff and volunteers that comprise our organization, then we don't have a balanced ecosystem. And so when we say things like, without you, this wouldn't be possible, that actually gets my back up as a fundraiser, because I sort of think to myself, I hope that this work will be possible when I'm not here and I'm not in a position to give. And donors, I think, want the same thing. They want to know that there's others that care about the things that they do, so that if they're not able to give at one point, or their interest and their focus changes, that there will be others that will carry on the work. And so I think that's restorative. That's restorative to us. That brings a lot more humanity and honesty and truth to the work that we're doing. And it also does a much better job of acknowledging all of the things that make money catalytic. And that includes staff, volunteers, beneficiaries, program partners, community partners, all of the people that make our missions possible. I think we need to do a better job of engaging those and weaving those into the conversations that we have with our funders and those that are bringing financial resources to bear, and making them also aware of the non-financial resources that are also catalytic to our organization. So those are some of the things that I think about when I think about restorative philanthropy and what that can mean practically for a fundraiser.
Yeah. Okay. There's so many like gems in everything that you're saying. I mean, one piece that I just want to kind of double click on from before is that relationship kind of redefinition of relationship. I think I've still been like marinating on that since you said it. It is like unbelievably liberating to think about it that way and to think about the relationship starting really once you've identified alignment and have like clarity on those pieces, because I talk a lot about like how we are told just go out there and build a relationship. But we're like, but don't talk about money, right? Like, don't talk about money. Get the person to like you enough so that in 12 to 18 months, they give you some type of hint that maybe now you can start talking about money, right? Like, just all these
Totally.
backwards ways we've been taught to fundraise. And then, like, as a fundraiser, that felt so confusing to me because I was like, wait a second, but in all my real relationships, I'm honest about why I'm in relationship with the person, or there's a level of transparency, there's a level of understanding around why we're both there. And now I'm being told to go develop a real relationship with a hidden agenda that I'm not talking about yet. And so like, I just really like the way that you're like pulling apart relationship from like even that more discovery process piece, and then sort of both people choosing to be in relationship once a level of alignment has been identified. I think that I love that.
I think for me, when I think about this stress and anxiety that I would have experienced as a young fundraiser growing up in the sector, a lot of the stress came from going to the meeting and having this idea that I needed to be the one to ultimately build a relationship and walk away after a meeting with someone that wants to be in a relationship with our organization. And that's really stressful because it's completely imbalanced. You start the relationship off in the worst, most imbalanced way, that I need to get you to like me versus we need to assess whether we have shared understanding of our work as an organization, who we are, what our values are, and then decide mutually if this is indeed mutually beneficial. That's much more empowering than going out there being like, you got to like find a way to get them interested in us. Like, we want to make sure we walk away with an opportunity to have a next meeting with them. And what's that next engagement? Well, that again makes it completely one-sided. So what are the questions that we put in our briefing notes? What's the information that we then gather as part of our due diligence that helps us shape those meetings? And sometimes it's, again, completely skewed around someone's interests, someone's past giving history, but very little around their values and very little to test for alignment with our organizational ethos and philosophy. And I think those are some of the practical things that I do now when I'm doing my prospect research and preparing for meetings, so I can bring wise relational practices so I can show up in an honest way rather than simply trying to get that metric of like, yes, success, we can have another touch point, moves management. We can like move this from identification to cultivation, right? Rather, it should be mutual.
Yeah. And that changes the whole way, like you were saying, that you experience feelings of like rejection too, right? Or uncertainty. In my book, I talk about the things that lead to fundraiser burnout that we don't normally talk about. So not just overwork, but uncertainty, rejection, isolation, power dynamics, pressure. All of these things have been scientifically proven to increase our stress response, lead us to chronic stress and to burnout. And we can't take away all of those in fundraising, right? Rejection is always going to be some part or some felt experience in fundraising. There are uncertainty. There's a lot of different components. Isolation, right? Inside organizations, especially smaller ones, a lot of times fundraisers feel really isolated, even just because everybody's like, well, I'm not a fundraiser, and then they feel some separation from their team members. So there's all these different pieces. And I think we need more like holistic ways to support fundraisers and tools for ourselves around that. But I do think everything that you are talking about also reframes things in a way that has a lot less things feeling like rejection, changes how we feel often in some of those power dynamics, like the strategies that you're talking about. I think like somatically allow for fundraisers to be in a more embodied state when they fundraise, and sort of doesn't lead to quite as much like dysregulation because you aren't telling this story, oh, this person didn't like me as a human being, and that's why this totally nebulous relationship isn't moving forward, as opposed to like, oh, what their priorities are and what our organization does are actually not the same.
Exactly. I think it's really helped me. When I say this, I think a lot of people bristle because they just assume that that means that you end up not building as many relationships. And maybe that is partially true, but you certainly build the more effective, values aligned relationships that actually do pay off dividends in the medium and long term, because you don't find yourself spending a lot of institutional resources trying to deal with requests, proposals, and opportunities from donors that really just are not aligned or not on the same page. And when I think about the things that cause me to feel stressed, isolated, frustrated, disempowered in the context of fundraising, it is almost always in connection with dealing with a donor that really doesn't understand how we work and what we do, and is frustrated about their experience. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding, and a lot of institutional time is spent trying to craft responses to them, trying to assuage their concerns, trying to pacify their upsetness, because we didn't do a very good job at the beginning of letting them know who we were and what we were all about. And that does happen over a very long period of time generally, but actually are the only person that has, as fundraising professionals, we are the ones to be able to undo some of that. And we actually need to remember that every exchange with a donor, if we're in a major gifts or planned giving context, is an opportunity to kind of reintroduce them to who we are and what our organization is all about. And I think that makes me feel much more empowered, that it's not one and done, and it's not like you can't ever follow up, but the next time you have an opportunity to engage with them is an opportunity to remind them about your values subtly, directly, in the communication that you share with them, in the next proposal that you put in front of them, in the next stewardship report. Talk about those things openly, because no one is going to redefine these relationships with donors for us. That is the work that we need to do. And we also, I think, have to acknowledge that we are the ones that have established these kind of relational dynamics, because we have put donors on a pedestal. It's not them putting themselves on there. And I've often found that donors, when you are truthful with them and really honest, that's really liberating for them too, because the big donors meet with lots of people and they're used to kind of the finesse that comes with professionalized fundraising. And people really value truth and honesty, I think, more than I think give ourselves credit for.
Yeah. Yes. 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 It feels so refreshing to just know that somebody's being authentic. And in some of my presentations, I talk about this fundraiser many years ago now said, fundraising makes me feel like a car salesperson, and not to bash car sales people, but I thought about that a lot and was like, okay, why is it that we go into car dealerships, at least here in the US, having done all of our research ahead of time, and we are go in there, all our notes, we know what we want, don't take the water, just,
Yep.
because we believe that that person wants to sell us a car, whether or not it's the right car for us. And that feels immediately puts us on guard. And I feel like what you're saying, the recommendations that you're making, tell donors, hey, I'm not here to make this work at all costs. I'm not here to convince you that what we're doing is in alignment with you. I'm here to see if we are in alignment. And I feel like it sets the donor at ease and actually makes them so much more open, because they don't feel like there's some kind of polished trick involved that is a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think I have an aversion to the things I share, although generally it's well received. But I think the people that do have an aversion, they worry that that means that you're rejecting donors and breaking up with donors. And I say that's just a very small minority. But those are probably the donors that do take up, the Peralta principle. They're the 20% that are taking up 80% of your time with their complaints and challenges, because the values are not aligned. It's usually can boil down to that. And so I think that frees up a lot more time to build relationships with the kinds of donors that do share your values and that probably have been neglected because there's only so much staff time, there's only so much staff resources. And so the loudest voices and often the loudest criticisms is what gets our attention. And so I think we need to remind ourselves of that. And also ultimately how much our mission can stagnate and how much we can move further away from our impact objectives as charitable organizations and nonprofits when we don't find ourselves in the right relationships, because we just basically are chasing funding and going here, there, and everywhere, but we're not getting closer to our ultimate destination and where we want to go because we're just following someone else's whims.
Okay, I could talk to you forever, and we probably should do a part 2 at some point, but where can folks go to follow you, connect with you, and just learn more about this?
Sure. Well, I hope that people will connect with me. I generate a lot of research and thought leadership on these topics available at recastphilanthropy.ca. They can also find me on LinkedIn at Tanya Hannah Rumble. I'm the only one on LinkedIn with that name, as well as Recast Philanthropy is also on LinkedIn. So I hope people will join me and connect. I really enjoy hearing people's perspectives on this work and sharing in the collective wisdom that really is abundant in our sector. So thank you for having me, Mallory.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and for this incredible conversation.
Thank you.